Welcome back, fellow wood warriors. Today on The Wooden Hobbyist, we have a challenge that will blow your sawdust-covered socks off. We're tackling the mighty task of building a massive 9-foot tall, 6-foot wide, and almost 3-foot deep set of built-in cabinets that barely fit this family of 8's home. Get ready to be amazed. Alright folks, before we dive in head first into this woodworking whirlwind, we need a plan. Think of this as our blueprint for greatness. I developed this design and sent it to the client, which prompted them to reply with this picture. Not sure what it meant, so we decided to combine the two designs. It's time to put our woodworking skills to the test. Grab your goggles and your favorite power tools because we're about to make some noise. Building big also means using big materials, which is a pain in the butt to break down in a small 20 by 20 garage shop. But with the modest combination of my low rip capacity table saw, cheap track saw, and a few other tools, we could tackle this project with a little more than a DIY mindset. We needed to get things cut to usable size first before fine-tuning everything later. This was pretty simple with a track and circular saw just to get everything to rough size. As I mentioned before, my table saw has an inadequate rip capacity for the size of these cabinets, so I decided to cut the large pieces one by one on the CNC. This is a time-consuming process, but at least I knew the piece would come out perfectly sized to fit just right into the client's home. Or did I? More on that later. CNCs are great, and it's possibly the best purchase I've made for my shop. The only problem I have is constantly having to get new bits after they dull. These cut well, but the edges were left a little rough and frayed. So, while I continued to cut each piece out, Sean grabbed a chisel and some sandpaper to smooth out the edges to assure a clean glue up later. This process is annoying, but at least it's satisfying to watch Sean do this instead of me. Once all of the cabinet sides, tops, and bottoms were cut, we marked out each side that needed a groove for the back panel. The back panels for these cabinets are made from 1/4-inch ply, and I wanted about a 1/4-inch deep groove for them to sit in. Using a flat top grind ripping blade, grooves were cut at all of the marked portions and test for fit before sneaking up on the final pass. We like to use these paddles to push directly above the blade so the depth remains consistent throughout the whole cut. For joinery, we started setting up for the next cheap DIY tool, the Wooden Hobbyist brand Domino joiner. We just clamped multiple pieces to the workbench and started marking accordingly so no extra or dumb cuts were made. We chose a domino joiner for speed, accuracy, and ease of use. Typically, I like to cut dados in grooves, but with how big this project is, both Sean and I decided on speeding through it to get to the more fun part, aka the part where we get paid for finishing this damn thing. Once joinery was cut, we got our measurements for the back panels and started cutting the 1/4-inch ply accordingly. Similar to the cabinet sides, my overall rip capacity wasn't enough, so I just cut them slightly oversized and used the CNC again. This time, I didn't cut all pieces one at a time. I came up with a quicker solution, or so I thought. By just cutting one of each size, I could stack all of the other pieces with double-sided tape and use the CNC cut piece as a template. This in fact did speed up production and got us that much closer to glue up. This portion of the video isn't even sped up. This is actually how fast it went, because of my genius idea. After stacking all of these and ensuring they were well stuck together, I moved to another cheap tool. Using the bandsaw, I cut as close as possible to the template piece so the router table didn't have much work to do. I installed this spiral flush cut bit, which honestly does horrible on end grain and hardwood, but for plywood, it's the perfect choice. My router table has seen a lot of use and abuse, and the height adjustment lock has actually fallen completely out. So I'm looking for an upgrade. I have no quarrels with this company, but I don't think expensive tools should just fall apart while in use. Other than that, this thing has been great, but nothing ever seems to make me completely happy. Other than flush trimming, because that shit is satisfying as fuck. I may not have mentioned it yet, but 4 of these cabinets will actually be used for hanging coats. 2 parents and 6 kids means needing a lot of space for clothing, so I'm doing just that. I used blue tape to help prevent chip out and marked my drilling locations accordingly. Using a large wood owl bit, I drilled approximately 3/8 of an inch deep so a properly sized corresponding dowel can be used as a hanging rod. My drill game was a little weak, but this will be covered up later. Using plywood as a backer piece, I cut this girthy dowel rod to size so it would fit in the cabinet. The reason I'm using such a thick dowel rod is for long-term strength. No, clothes are not heavy, but kids are, and long-term use needs long-term strength. Starting with the dowels, I started a dry fit of each cabinet to make sure everything was properly lined up before glue up, and surprisingly, everything looked great with more than enough room for a standard size clothing hanger. Due to the size of each cabinet, I found it easier to knock out sanding and finish before gluing up. I did this for 2 reasons. 1, it's way easier with each piece laid out flat in front of you. 2, glue doesn't stick to finish, so squeeze out cleans up easily. Once sanded up to 180 grit, I cleaned off the pieces and applied a hard wax oil finish. It goes on easy and cures fast as well. Again, fast for the win. I didn't want to spend hours and hours finishing this with something else. The finish doesn't really affect the glue strength either, as I'm using dominoes and another fastening technique. Pocket hole screws. If you haven't thought of it yet, the only visible portion of these cabinets will be the insides once complete, so pocket holes just add to the strength and longevity. Kind of like that little blue pill, but for wood, the tree type of wood. These screws also help with glue up as I didn't have enough properly sized clamps for all of the cabinet shells. I could just clamp together, drive the screws, remove the clamps, and start on the next piece. For size reference, here's one of the cabinets compared to my double chin. As you can see, it's quite massive, and so is the cabinet. I did get a full-blown workout each time I had to make room for the next glue up, but we eventually got there after a few close calls. After they were assembled, I stacked them up here just to get another shot. Believe it or not, those shorter fat cabinet shells are actually the top pieces. I did a quick once over of the interiors just to ensure no squeeze out was hanging around and everything was square. A quick outfit change later, not an overnight dry, and I came up with another idea to help with installation later on. One by one, I started spreading out the cabinet shells around the shop to do another little trick with the domino joiner. But because I'm short, I grabbed my trusty little shop stool and began cutting slots for the dominoes. These are strictly for aligning during installation, not any form of glue up. I just used the edge guide thingies and started thrusting away. This would make sure all edges were flush with each other in all directions. I then awkwardly removed these shells to test if my idea worked, and wouldn't you know it, it did. These things just slid right into place without any issues at all. Little did I know this would come back to bite me in the ass later on. And now it's later on. We needed to fit these big cabinets into this small area. Sean and I got these things delivered to be assembled in the client's home. Right before installing them into place, we managed to get everything assembled and stood this massive top portion up. This was just before realizing the overall cabinet width was approximately a ½ inch too wide. This meant only installing the sides and having to take the top pieces back to the shop for adjustments. Mistakes happen, and they always say measure twice and cut once. Well, we measured like 50 times and cut once, which apparently didn't work. To be honest, it's not really a mistake if it can be fixed with an electric hand plane or hack job. Since we removed the thickness from the side portions of the top cabinets that bear no weight, no strength is actually lost here. And just like that, we got the top cabinets installed and screwed into place. This thing is massive, and I didn't realize how not plumb and out of square this house was. That being said, Sean broke out his long, soft poplar and his tight man jeans so we could get started on the face frames and doors, which was a daunting task itself. Using the jigsaw, he cut them down to manageable lengths to make the milling process easier. These boards have acclimated well to the shop, so it only took a few passes at the joiner to get them nice and straight. They are 8/4 and we wanted to save as much thickness as possible. Reason being, the thickness will actually be the width of our face frames and door frames. The pencil marks allowed us to visibly remove as little material as possible at the planer so we could keep them thick enough to rip them into quarter sawn strips. When you cut flat sawn lumber this way, you actually get quarter sawn pieces which will be much more stable in the long run. This is particularly important with doors. It wasn't long until we had 3/4 inch pieces, as we just ripped them to approximately 7/8 of an inch thick before planing them down. I set up the miter saw on the workbench to get these things individually cut to length. There were a total of 8 doors and 2 drawer faces, leaving a total of 40 pieces needing to be cut for final assembly. 40 pieces doesn't sound like a lot, but when you need to cut all of them to specific lengths, cut grooves for the door panels, add joinery, and clamp and glue up, it takes quite a bit of time. Again, I'm going to use a Domino joiner here, but just so you don't think I'm a complete idiot, I have other videos that show me making doors the traditional way and another with pocket holes. Honestly, doesn't matter with paint grade pieces. The only thing that really matters is stability and strength. The Domino joiner just makes quick work of all 40 pieces because each piece of wood needed 2 mortises, making a total of 80 mortises in the end. Doing anything 80 times is tedious and sometimes strenuous. Obviously, I made sure to dry fit each piece and check for square before moving on to the next step. I carefully marked each piece, and this is where I have to add a groove for the panels to slip in. 1/4 inch ply isn't actually 1/4 of an inch, it's technically smaller, so I used a 1/8 inch straight bit to cut the grooves and snuck up to the perfect fit. Again, 40 pieces at 2 passes a piece meant 80 passes. Once I was happy with the grooves, I just ripped some more 1/4 inch ply down to fit the panels correctly. It was all assembly after these cuts were made, and I was more than confident after dry fitting everything earlier. During glue up, I made sure to add only glue to the butt joints and dominoes. This allowed for movement, although I didn't really expect much movement the way this poplar was cut. It's extremely satisfying just snapping pieces into place like this and seeing everything come together. There's something about cabinet doors that just looks so cool before they're painted. I got each of them glued up, and after they dried, I smoothed everything out with 120 grit sandpaper. This just ensures an even surface to round over edges and drill for hinges. I'm in love with this Kreg hinge jig. Not sponsored, so it'll probably become the wooden hobbyist hinge jig soon. It just works so easily, and I never have problems with hinges anymore. A 1/4 inch roundover was added to all of the faces, then they were painted off camera. While they were being painted, I just wanted to gloss over the board and batten. I ripped 3-inch strips of 1/2 inch MDF for it. They were attached using construction adhesive and 18 gauge nails. You're probably wondering about the back portion they're attached to. I just made a 2x4 frame with the standard stud spacing and screwed on a sheet of 1/2 inch plywood. This will provide more than enough strength for its intended use. I was just making sure to check for level each time I pinned one on. And that bench there is just some standard acacia butcher block, picked out by the client to match their kitchen table. I'm not a painter, so I didn't plan on showing that whole process in my basement. Just know I filled all the gaps and holes and nuances with standard hardwood filler. Sanded it multiple times, primed it with about 4 coats, and painted it with a cheap sprayer I found on Amazon. Installation was the last step to making this thing look complete. I'll be honest, I completely skipped over making the drawers for this bench in this video. They were a hassle and I ran into a lot of issues, too many to share here. Nonetheless, this thing was at a point of being usable and I couldn't be happier with the results. It really is massive, not just the height, but the depth too. It's about 10 to 14 inches deeper than standard cabinets, so this family has a lot more space to fill compared to the tiny closet that used to be here beforehand. I always make sure to open and close every door multiple times, not to test anything in particular, just for my own satisfaction. Onto the hardware, which was made super easy with this the wooden hobbyist jig. I just drilled in the little hole thingies and installed the pulls accordingly. These pulls were chosen by the client to match the rest of their house, and honestly, they gave quite the elegant look. Here's those drawers I didn't show you. They're A4 maple ply with walnut edge banding with removable angled dividers for shoes to sit on. This was a special request and it took me a few tries to get it right, but I loved the turnout. Just a quick run through of how big this thing actually is after the client started putting it to use. These things just swallow these jackets. The soft closed doors add a nice delicate touch to offset the overwhelming size. Multiple double-sided hooks to maximize backpacks and school supplies. above a nice seating area with upper storage capable of holding hundreds of board games. Thanks for watching. Happy building.